All right, welcome back, everybody, from the break to our second session of this morning, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Hanna Notte here as our speaker, and to have the privilege of introducing her. I'll sort of make three, in good academic fashion, 3 points in the introduction. I'll save the most important for last. The first point is that as of September 1st, Hanna will be the director of Eurasian Studies, is that the way to put it? Or
Director for Eurasia.
Director for Eurasia at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. That's not a current title, but soon to be Hanna's title. Secondly, Hanna is my colleague at CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, where Hanna is a senior non-resident associate, and in both capacities writes widely on issues related to nuclear weapons, and I would say is somebody who is a pioneer in the analysis of Russia in the global space. That's been a revelation of the war to some of us, that all of this has not just a European resonance, Russian foreign policy, but a global resonance, and I think Hanna has been there for many years, and that's made her a unique commentator on the war, as you'll see in just a moment, in terms of the theme that we have before us: Russia, Turkey, the Middle East nexus, enormously illuminating and helpful, not to exclude the European dimension, but not to make it the only dimension for Russia's sphere of operations and ambitions. But thirdly, and I would say in this context most importantly, Hanna is an alumna of the Monterey Summer Symposium, class of 2017. So
First class
of 2017, and I think one of the many sources of pride that the Summer Symposium has in terms of gathering talent and seeing that talent go out into the world and do what it does. So with all of that, it's great to have you here this morning and with us for the Summer Symposium. The floor is yours. I think we'll have about 45 minutes of presentation, and then the questions will belong to the fellows.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. And it's really great to be here with all of you. So I'm, unlike many, I think, who've been teaching you already or will in the symposium, I'm not a historian. I studied IR. I work on current Russian foreign and security policy, particularly Russia's relations with the Middle East. And I worked before my current job for a number of years in Track 2 mediation on the Middle East, specifically the Syrian conflict. And I was kind of the point person of the organization to go to Moscow and try to do advocacy with the Russian government on behalf of our Track 2 and our engagement with Syrians. So I'll sort of channel those kinds of heads in the lecture. And what I wanted to do in this lecture today is really look at how the Russia-Turkey relationship, how both interact in the Middle East in different theaters, on different layers, how that is connected with the region that we're in today. And I think it's always good to have some maps to look at, just to see how close actually Russia and the South Caucasus are to the Middle East. This is kind of kind of zoomed in, but this is sort of a broader map where I encircled the South Caucasus up there, and then you see the North Africa and Middle East region around it. And just to give a couple of sort of statistics here, Baku is actually closer to both Doha and Ankara, about 1,000 miles, than it is to Moscow, which is 1,300 miles. Tbilisi is just 800 miles to Ankara, and Yerevan, where we're right now, is just a few hundred miles to Mosul in Iraq, which used to have a sizable Armenian community. There's other links between the South Caucasus and the Middle East, of course, travel routes, diaspora populations, if you think about the Armenians in Lebanon, but also in Syria, particularly before the war broke out there. And then there's been some connections in more recent years, and we'll get to that in the lecture, with the issue of foreign fighters. So foreign fighters joining the jihad in Iraq and in Syria, both from Georgia, from the Pankisi, but also from Azerbaijan. And then the concern in the Second Karabakh War that Turkey would be channeling Syrian fighters into the region. What I wanted to do today is sort of go in 4 stages. First of all, I very quickly just wanted to go through what Russia's interests today are in the Middle East and North Africa region, then turn to Russia-Turkey relations and go through the different layers of mutual interests that they have, particularly in the geographies in which they intersect, and then characterize that relationship as one of adversarial collaboration, where Russia and Turkey have leverages over each other in different theaters, and just kind of characterize how that looked like before February 2022, to then finish off by arguing that there have been shifts in that relationship and in leverage since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. And that has repercussions across the Middle East region, but also here in the South Caucasus. So that's the idea for today. And I hope it's not too small, my slides. I just put them together yesterday, but I think we're okay. So just really briefly going through Russia's interest in the Middle East region. I think security interests have always been paramount for the Russian Federation in that region, with really two dimensions. I mean, Russia was always concerned with preventing the spillover of extremism, of Islamist threats to the Russian Federation and to adjacent countries. That is the prism through which Russia looked at the Arab Spring to a large degree. It is what partially drove it to engage in Syria from 2015. But it's also been, of course, about drawing a line against what Russia has seen as Western fomented regime change in the region, especially with the Libya precedent in 2011. And, I think that was a very vexing moment for Russia that under Medvedev, Russia abstained on the Security Council, and then the Western-led coalition overthrew the Gaddafi government, and Russia was not going to let that scenario be repeated in Syria. But I think there's been another dimension added to Russian security interests in the region, which is perhaps more recent, which is that Russia has used the presence that it established there in Khmeimim, the airbase in Syria, but also the naval port of Tartus, to project power into the Eastern Mediterranean vis-à-vis NATO. Russia has effectively brought itself in a position where it can poke NATO forces in that theater, which I think has been important against the backdrop of sort of aggravating relations between Russia and the West in recent years. Russia has economic interests in this region. They are not unimportant. They've been expanding in recent years, especially after Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, when the West first leveled sanctions against Russia. Russia is largely competitive in very specific domains in the region. There's arms sales, which have been very important to Algeria, to Egypt, also to the Iraqis, actually. When Iraq was fighting the Islamic State, they got a lot of weapons from Russia, actually. Russia is a highly competitive player on civilian nuclear technology. It's building the Akuyu power plant in Egypt. It's building the El Daba first nuclear power plant in Egypt. Russia has been an important exporter of grain, of course, which became a very sort of prominent topic over the last year. Russian tourists going to the region, very important source of income for the region, especially for the Egyptians and the Turkish economy. Then there's some energy cooperation, and of course, Russia's coordination in the OPEC Plus format, specifically with Saudi Arabia, coordinating on oil prices. And then Russia is not really an investor in the region, unlike the Chinese. Russia has been trying to draw some Gulf investment into its own economy with varying degrees of success over the last years. But these are sort of the main economic areas. And then I would pose to you that leveraging this presence, building on the Syria precedent, to be a player on all sorts of conflicts in the region has also been a matter of status and prestige for the Russian Federation. To have a seat at the table in pretty much any regional conflict. Libya, of course, still Syria, which is ongoing, Gulf affairs. Israel-Palestine has been historically a file on which Russia has wanted to play in the context of the Middle East Quartet. So these are sort of the Russian interests in the region. And so Turkey has actually been a really important player for Russia in that whole space. Actually a more important trade partner for Russia in the region than the Arabs, which were Russia's historical partners during the Cold War. I think if you look at the trade numbers, certainly now they've even increased since last year. But then, of course, also Russia's dealings with Turkey in Syria and in Libya, which I want to turn to now. So what I first wanted to do is sort of very quickly go through, at the broad level, what are the fundamental interests that Russia and Turkey have vis-a-vis each other in the broad relationship? And then we'll go kind of theater by theater. So first of all, I think it's really important for Russia to deal with Turkey because Turkey is present in the South Caucasus, in Libya, and in Syria, and can harm Russian interests there. And so Russia needs to make sure that Turkey doesn't cross what Russia considers red lines. And we'll go through these different theaters in a moment. But of course, Turkey is also a NATO ally. And it's been pretty important for Russia to have that amicable relationship with Turkey, keep Turkey close, because it is a source of being able to foster friction within the NATO alliance. I mean, for years, so there was the question whether Russia would try to push Turkey out of NATO. And when I posed that question to colleagues in Moscow and said, do you think this is the Russian endgame? They would say, no, why would we want that? We don't want Turkey to leave NATO. Also, we're very realistic. That's never going to happen. But for us to have a good relationship with Turkey, and Turkey is in the alliance, that's sort of good for us. And I think now, with Turkey dragging its feet over Sweden's accession to NATO, for instance, I'm not suggesting that that is due to Russian pressure primarily, but I think it's probably something that Moscow likes to see in the current environment. And then there's economic interests. Russia sells a lot of gas to Turkey. I've mentioned the Akuyu, and that's become just even more important in light of Western sanctions. And tomorrow, I'm giving another lecture on shifts in Russian foreign policy since last year. I think Turkey has become very important as a conduit for the roundabout trade into Russia as well. For Turkey, Russia is also very important. Turkey has a perception that the United States, with its policy, destabilized the region, especially the invasion of Iraq in 2003, so that there was first destructive US policy in the region, and then from the 2010s, progressive disengagement from the region, from Turkey's broader neighborhood, and Russia made inroads in that geography. So if you're Turkey, you just simply have to deal with Russia, notwithstanding historic distrust, notwithstanding disagreements. That is what Turkey has felt the need to do. Turkish experts actually classify Russia as one has said to me, for us, Russia is a dangerous enemy. Russia has actually the means to cause problems for us domestically because it can interfere with Turkey's ethnic, religious, and other tensions. So we just have to deal with the Russians. Also, as part of Turkey's broader, I think, pursuit of strategic autonomy in its foreign policy more broadly, simply having diversified great power relations has been important for Turkey in the last few years. And then the economic interests were very important for Turkey as well. I mentioned the tourists coming, contractors going to Russia for projects, the import of Russian gas and Akuyu. And perhaps the last thing I'll say on this relationship more broadly is that there's been a great deal of anti-Americanism, I think, in Turkey over the last years, or I would say sort of proceeding from the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It's not the case that has neatly translated into a sort of coherent pro-Eurasianism. It's just that space was opened up for I think, different kinds of pro-Eurasianism to take hold, but there's not a sort of single pro-Russian or pro-Asianist constituency in Turkey. It's more loosely linked anti-American elements, also in both in military and civilian circles. And I think both sides would still hold today that the level of institutionalization of the relationship is relatively low. So the Erdogan-Putin rapport has really mattered. Institutionalization has increased somewhat, I think, over the last few years, through the Astana format on Syria, the 2+2 talks on the Syrian and Libyan conflict, and expanded business ties, but still it's being characterized as relatively little institutionalized. So now I would like to go through these different geographies to just kind of see where they play together, how that looks like, and then how the different theaters are actually connected. And I want to start with Syria and the Eastern Med, and maybe I'll just put a map up here for a second again. So there's no time to go through the origins of the Syrian conflicts. I'll try to just be really brief and say that, of course, Russian and Turkish interests on the Syrian war diverged significantly at the beginning. Turkey had a big problem with Assad, wanted him to stay aside, and of course the Russians supported the government by Bashar al-Assad. Russia intervened in the conflict, let's recall that, in September 2015, and we had this big rift in Russia-Turkey relations after the shoot-down of a Russian fighter jet in November 2015. And as I learned last night, there's actually a movie about this episode, a Russian movie called Neba, which I'm now very excited to watch. I mean, it was a big thing in Russia-Turkey relations. Russia leveled sanctions against Turkey afterwards. But then the two sides reconciled in the summer of 2016. And basically what I think in a nutshell happened is the following. Turkey proceeded to deprioritize the departure of Bashar al-Assad and prioritize the perceived Kurdish threat in Syria. So let's recall that the Americans had started to conduct airstrikes against ISIL in Iraq and then in Syria in 2014 as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. As part of that effort, the Americans not only supported the armed opposition in Syria of various stripes, but also the Kurdish forces in northeast Syria. And Turkey grew increasingly nervous about that. By the time we get to the summer of 2016, the Russians are well into this war, and they have, enabled the regime to make some headway in striking back against the opposition. By that time, the Turks launched an operation against Kurdish forces, Operation Euphrates Shield in the north of Syria, and Russia sort of gives a yellow light, I would say, to that operation. They don't sort of tell Turkey off. They don't exactly condone it, but they let it pass. And then Turkey acquiesces to the fall of Aleppo in December 2016. So you have this convergence between Russia and Turkey. And then from January 2017, they start working together in the Astana format with Iran. And I think this is a really important shift in the Syrian conflict, that Turkey gradually, so even though their interests continue to diverge, Turkey basically sort of realizes, well, if the Americans are supporting the Kurds, maybe we got to work with the Russians and the Iranians. And so, again, just quickly running through the trajectory of the conflict, you have the Astana format from 2017, in which Iran, Turkey, and Russia regularly coordinate. You have the installation of so-called de-escalation zones across Syria, where fighting stops. The regime turns further towards the east, towards Deir ez-Zor, to retake more territory, and in 2018 turns back towards the de-escalation zones to mop them up one after the other, with the exception of Idlib in the northwest of the country, which still remains rebel-controlled to this day. And so what basically happens is that we're now in a situation where Russia and Turkey need to deconflict. In the northeast of the country, they signed a memorandum of understanding in 2019 because you have Russian forces in the area, but also Turkey had led multiple incursions into the area. So you have Turkish forces there, and you have Turkish forces in the northwest of the country and in Idlib. So you have deconfliction and joint patrols along the M4 highway there as well. This is basically the situation why the two needed to really coordinate a lot together. I won't go sort of through what happened with the political process because it would take too much time. But where are we today in terms of their interests? So I think for Russia, it absolutely wants to maintain its influence, its sphere of interest in Syria, to project power into the broader MENA region and the Mediterranean. It wants to normalize the position of the Assad government internationally now, which it is doing fairly successfully. Neutralize threats from this northwest of the country where you still have the rebels. And it's been fairly quiet there over the last year, but not always quiet. And then also ensure, importantly for Russia, it wants territorial integrity, and state sovereignty over all of Syria. So the end game here is Turkey got to leave at some point. And this is where the big clash comes with Turkey. For Turkey, it wants to contain any threats to Turkey's stability and territorial integrity. And so I think it's really important to reiterate again, the Kurdish issue is the number one threat from the point of view of the Turkish state. And so Turkey calculates that for the time being, they got to stay in Syria, including in the northwest of the country, and make sure that the Turkish-backed groups there maintain their autonomy vis-a-vis the regime, because Turkey needs it as a platform to deal with the Kurdish threat in the northeast of the country. It also wants to create an environment conducive for Syrian refugees to return to Turkey, which would realistically mean some sort of political change in the country, which hasn't really happened, and where you could make the argument that Russia hasn't been exactly helpful in the political process to make that happen. Just very quickly, so the bottom line here is that Russia and Turkey have shared an interest in dealing with each other and coordinating, but their interests in Syria do not converge. Again, Russia wants the regime to return all over Syria, whereas for Turkey, sort of autonomy for the groups that it backs in the northwest is desirable. And I would just sort of finally say here that Turkey is now particularly concerned with the recent normalization that Russia has pushed. You might have heard that Syria returned to the League of Arab States very recently. It's now again dealing with the Arab states. So there's a concern in Ankara that the Arabs are gaining leverage over Damascus. And the Arabs have suggested that the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, of which the YPG, the Kurdish forces, the backbone, they should be integrated into the Syrian Arab army. That's the way to deal with the situation in the northeast of the country. Turkey is concerned about that. That's not good enough for them. They worry that if Kurdish power is simply sort of integrated into the Syrian state, they won't have dealt with that threat sustainably. And so where are we right now in Syria? Well, the Russians are trying to push normalization between Syria and Turkey. But now with Erdogan being re-elected, it doesn't look like this is going to go anywhere imminently. Just very recently, Turkey basically said, no, we're not leaving Syria yet. And Syria said, well, as long as you're not leaving, we're not normalizing. Russia put forward some sort of roadmap, so we need to see sort of what happens there. Again, things have been fairly quiet between Russia and Turkey in the Idlib province, but curiously, last 2 weeks, there were quite intensified Russian airstrikes on Idlib, actually coinciding with the Wagner mutiny inside Russia. Even on the day that Prigozhin was marching towards Moscow, there were reports, which of course no one was paying attention to in the media, that there were airstrikes on Idlib, quite interestingly, and over the last week with fairly high civilian casualties. And, prospect for Russia-Turkey friction remains. A Russian soldier was killed in June by Turkish shelling in northern Syria. So it's been much quieter than it was maybe a few years ago, but there is still sort of potential for conflict. Let's go towards Libya. I have a map again. Again, I'm not going to go into the history of this conflict. I will just say that Russia and Turkey both have important interests in that country, actually dating back to the Gaddafi era. Russia has been considered a backer of General Haftar, who leads the LNA, the Libyan National Army, in the east of the country over the last years. Haftar is also supported by Egypt and the Emirates. And Haftar has been the Russian MOD's preferred interlocutor in Libya, also given his strong position in the past on counterterrorism in the country. But importantly, the Russians have always been good over the last few years to actually try to maintain ties with all sorts of actors in the Libyan landscape, even sort of former Gaddafi figures, political figures in the west of the country. So that's important to bear in mind. And so what happened in 2019, in April 2019, is that conflict broke out again when Haftar launched an offensive towards Tripoli in the west. And Russia, which I should note, is not present in Libya with an overt official military presence, but the Wagner private military company has been present actually alongside a bunch of other Russian PMCs since 2017, 2018. So by the point this fighting broke out, Wagner had a fairly sizable presence in the east, advising the LNA, supporting the LNA. When that fighting broke out, Russia was initially sitting on its hands. I don't think that they wanted Haftar to do this, but when they realized that he was struggling and losing ground, Wagner interfered in the conflict on the side of General Haftar. And there was an intensified presence by Wagner to support him. And in the fall of that year, Turkey signed an agreement, actually 2 agreements, with the government sitting in the West, the GNA, the Government of National Accord, an important maritime deal that delineated Turkey's entitlement to an expanded exclusive economic zone in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the response to which Egypt, Israel, Greece, and Cyprus all said, no, thank you very much. Like, this is not legal. You cannot do this. But Turkey signed it with the GNA, and it also signed a military agreement for support for Libya. So when this fighting was going on, Turkey decided to step in on the side of the GNA. And it really stepped up its own military support for the government led by Faisal Sarraj, the GNA, to stall the offensive. And they brought a lot of military hardware to bear. Air defense systems, advisors for the Libyan armed forces, and most importantly, TB2 Bayraktar drones, which played a really important role in this conflict, quite successfully against Russian air defense systems like the Pantsir. One thing I want to note here, because it's sort of the first link that's created between our 2 theaters, between Syria and Libya, the Turks started to recruit Syrian fighters to come and help fight on the side of the GNA. Wagner, meanwhile, was also recruiting Syrians to come and fight on the side of the LNA. So mind-blowingly, in this conflict in Libya, you had Syrians fighting on both sides of the conflict against each other in a different country. Of course, the Hmeimim air base in Syria was also an important logistics hub for Wagner to bring military assets into Libya. So you had to have the Syria-Libya connection emerging there. Fasting forward quickly, so in 2020, in May, there was an apparent Russian-Turkish understanding to end this war over Tripoli. And what Ankara did is basically let the Wagner forces exit the Greater Tripoli area unharmed, and they retreated across a line which unfortunately is not seen on the map between Sirte and Jufra, sort of in the middle of the country, where the oil crescent lies. And basically that line has sort of been stable ever since. Turkish forces are there, Wagner forces are there. The political process, which I'm not going to go into, has been really stalled in the last few years. And so both Russia and Turkey have maintained their presence. Just really quickly, how I see both sides' interests there. So I think for Russia, it's really important to keep that presence, which is relatively low-key and low-cost in Libya because it's not overt, to project power into the southern Mediterranean. Again, sort of a platform from which to project power vis-a-vis NATO, I think, into the southern Mediterranean, becoming more important in light of this confrontation that we find ourselves in. And to keep that presence, what's really important for Russia is basically that any future Libyan government, regardless of how the wind's going to blow, is friendly to Russia, that they're not going to kick Russia out, which is why you cultivate ties with all sorts of different actors in the Libyan landscape. Russia does have economic interests in Libya dating back to the Gaddafi era. I think they lost a lot of, there's a lot of pending oil contracts there that were sort of frozen with the war that Russia would like to renew. And then more recently, I would say, I mean, Libya is also a hub for both Russia and Turkey to project power into Africa. I mean, Wagner now has a presence in the Central African Republic and Mali. And, it's sort of established that they have used Libya as a platform to build that presence further down in Africa. Turkey, I mentioned the energy, the Eastern Med economic interests. So that deal with the GNA in 2019 was really important. Now, curiously, Turkey has also, I think, wanted to use this entry into the Libyan conflict to some extent to break its isolation in the Arab world. Turkey had a lot of friction with Arab countries over the last decade because of its purported support for the Muslim Brotherhood, for other Islamists. Only now, recently, you see Turkey making up with the likes of Egypt or the UAE or so on. But at that time, things were still looking pretty bad. Turkey has been able to test weapons in that conflict, and the TB2 Bayraktar drones in October 2020 became really important in the Second Karabakh War. But before that, they were already very successfully deployed in Libya. And again, so Turkey wants to maintain a privileged relationship. with the government there. And you know, perhaps the last thing to say here is, I mean, I circled this on the map. In the red circles, these are Turkish, where Turkey has bases, and then the green ones are where Wagner is maintaining bases. And the Turks have really more institutionalized their military presence at the Watia base, at the Tunisian border, and then, you know, training Libyan forces. You know, that presence has really taken down some roots. Now, of course, according to the international community, all foreign forces are supposed to leave Libya on paper, but because the political process is still very much stalled, that hasn't really happened. Okay, let's go to the South. Oh, Caucasus. There we are. Yeah, for which I don't have a map, but we can go back to the original map, maybe. Yeah. Anyway, I can also just show this slide. I'll keep this a little bit shorter. Regarding the interests, I mean, I think, as you all know, and probably hear in other lectures, the South Caucasus is pretty much an extension of Russia's domestic security agenda. What happens in this region is intimately connected with security inside Russia. I think maintaining primacy in the region, minimizing Western influence in this part of the world has been a long-standing Russian interest. And then perhaps also maintaining leverage over the delivery of hydrocarbon resources through this region to Europe via pipelines that run through the South Caucasus, especially with Azerbaijan stepping up as a deliverer of gas. Whereas Turkish interests, I think, have also included stability, but perhaps in a context that favors Azerbaijan. And there's been an opportunity in recent years to change the status quo in favor of Azerbaijan. If you look at how the Turkish foreign ministry characterizes the South Caucasus, they talk about it economically being an important land bridge to Central Asia. They talk about deep-rooted historical and cultural ties. And I think gaining influence in this region has also been part of Turkey's broader quest for a strategic autonomy. So let's talk a little bit about the Second Karabakh War in fall 2020, because that is when Turkey really steps up the game in this region, and when links to these other theaters, Syria and Libya, I think become apparent. Turkey supported, I already mentioned this, Azerbaijan quite significantly in the Second Karabakh War, including with Turkish drones. And we had a ceasefire deal that was then signed in fall 2020, brokered by the Russians, signed by Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Turkey was not a signatory to the ceasefire deal. And after that, you had Russian boots on the ground, no direct Turkish military role, I think only Turkish observers according to the deal, whereas Russia presented the peacekeeping force. So Russia, in a way, you could argue, retained its primacy. But of course, Turkey had gained significant leverage, its military support for Azerbaijan, greater clout in Baku's decision-making, and the delivery of military hardware to Azerbaijan really stepped up. Already during the war, you could see the linkage between Karabakh and the Syrian conflict. So to express its displeasure with how Turkey was stepping up the game during this conflict, Russia actually engaged in quite intensified airstrikes in Idlib during that time period, just to send a message to Ankara. And as I already mentioned, there was a great concern at the time. I remember, I think I was in Moscow at that time, speaking with sort of Russian experts working on the South Caucasus, this concern that Turkey would channel foreign fighters from Syria to fight on the side of Azerbaijan in the conflict, and that there could be this sort of spread of Sunni extremism in the region was something that Russian experts really noted at the time. So this is so much for the South Caucasus. I just want to mention, I don't have a slide on it here, but I just want to mention that, of course, one other arena in which they intersect, or which can be a source of leverage, is the Black Sea, where Russia, of course, has engaged in a significant naval buildup after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, has wanted freedom of navigation and a favorable balance of power for Russia to be ensured. And Turkey, as a steward over the Montreux Convention, has an important sort of point of leverage here over Russia. So the 1936 Montreux Convention is what regulates the passage of naval warships through the straits. And Turkey is allowed to regulate that and to restrict the passage of non-Black Sea littoral states into the area. Turkey has largely implemented that convention faithfully, including since Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. So a colleague of mine, Galip Dalay, who's a Turkish scholar at SWP in Berlin, he has called this relationship between Russia and Turkey that is playing out across these different geographies one of adversarial collaboration. There's also those who say it's a cooperation, coordination, competition nexus or something like this, meaning that their interests are diverging in these different theaters. Russia backs or controls one side of a conflict, Turkey the other, though I think you could put a big question mark over the extent of control, because none of these proxies in any of these theaters are fully controlled by either Moscow or Ankara. I think there's a lot of agency by these local actors, of course, but Russia and Turkey sort of back, broadly speaking, opposing sides in these different theaters, but still both sides have concluded that it's better to coordinate, to collaborate with each other, rather than to pursue a zero-sum game vis-a-vis each other. That has basically been the calculation in these different theaters, and of course both have therefore accrued different levers or sort of cards to play over each other in these different theaters. So I just quickly want to go through them again. Where can Russia harm Turkey in Syria? Russia can theoretically, and has done in the past, enable Syria's Kurds by giving them weapons, for example, or hosting them in Moscow. I mean, when I was doing this Track 2 work, the amount of times that I was in Moscow and we were meeting with some sort of Kurdish actors in Moscow was rather frequent. So, I mean, Moscow has maintained ties with the Syrian Kurds, and that has been a thorn in the eye of Ankara. The biggest card Russia had over Turkey and Syria was its ability to enable friction in Idlib, perhaps even another regime offensive. Why does that matter? Because where will the refugees go? They will go to Turkey. And Turkey has had a lot of Syrian refugees. You might have heard how big of an issue it was before the elections in Turkey, that Syrian refugees should leave the country. So this has been, I think, the biggest vulnerability from the point of Turkey, what Russia could do in Idlib. Turkey has leverage over Russia too. It controls the straits, and actually, Turkey closed the Syria-bound airspace for Russia after the invasion of Ukraine started. But probably the leverage has been more on the Russian side than on the Turkish side. In Libya, Russia's leverage is that it has maintained its ability to cultivate relations with all actors, including those that deal with Turkey. But of course, Turkey has, introduced the TB2 Bayraktar drones very successfully and other military hardware, so it gained some leverage over Russia there. In the South Caucasus, you could make the argument, I suppose, that Russia has maintained primacy after the Second Karabakh War, given the terms of the ceasefire agreement. But Turkey has gained important leverage over Azerbaijan, and then potentially in creating this connection between Syria and the South Caucasus. And then in the Black Sea, Turkey retains the Montreux Convention as a point of leverage. And you could more recently say Turkish delivery of drones to Ukraine has also become a point of leverage for Turkey in the Black Sea. I did this project last year where we were looking at Russia-Turkey relations and speaking with a lot of Turkish experts. And their assessment was basically that until the war in Ukraine started, Turkey in this whole mix that I just presented was overall, bottom line, the more vulnerable party. It was more dependent on Russia economically than vice versa. It was very vulnerable to Russian leverage in Syria. Yes, it had accumulated some leverage in Libya and the South Caucasus, but overall, if you put all the cards on the table, they felt themselves to be the weaker party. And that has shifted, I think, slightly with the invasion of Ukraine, and I'll come to this in a moment. But the MENA South Caucasus nexus before February 2022, actually, not 2020, at the bottom of the slide. I mean, I've already mentioned all these points. Turkey's ability to put pressure on Russia in the South Caucasus to pressure it elsewhere, whether in Libya or Syria, the foreign fighter concern. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, where you see an initial sort of nexus emerging for the first time, is Russian military were observing how the TB2 Bayraktar drones were used in the Second Karabakh War. And I think they were rather impressed. And so if you look at sort of Russian writings on the development of their own drone industry, there was a lot of learning, both from their own use of drones in Syria, but then also from the Turkish drones in the Second Karabakh War, which sort of played into Russia's own thinking about drone warfare, and perhaps also into their decision to procure the Shahed drones from Iran in the context of this current conflict. So I think the drone warfare element is also interesting here. So let's go to what's happening today. I think I need like 5 or 10 more minutes and then I'll be done. So I would argue that overall, Turkey has gained in leverage over Russia since February of last year. What do you see in Syria? In Syria, you've seen an emboldened Turkey. You might recall that last summer, Turkey was hinting repeatedly that they might launch another incursion into northern Syria. The US was saying, no, don't do this. The Europeans were saying, don't do this. Russia was also saying, please don't do this. It didn't happen in the end. But I think Turkey felt itself emboldened because, of course, it was also stepping up with this unprecedented mediator role in the war in Ukraine on operational issues. I mean, not just operational issues. I suppose the Istanbul talks between Ukraine and Russia were held, in Turkey last spring. But then the grain deal was hammered out in Turkey. If you look at where the IAEA chief Grossi and Rosatom met regarding the safety of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, that's happened in Turkey. Turkey tried to mediate, I think, safe passage out of Mariupol at some point. I mean, a lot of kind of mediation activity on issues related to Ukraine have happened in Turkey, partially because of Russia's reluctance to meet in places such as Geneva, for example. So Turkey had this enhanced role and felt itself more emboldened. It closed the airspace to Syria, as I already mentioned. And Russia has been a little more risk-averse in Syria. You didn't really see major action in Idlib over the last year. Only now that's changing in the last few weeks. Russia, importantly, extended the mechanism for cross-border aid delivered into northern Syria. So let me show you quickly the map again. So from Turkey into Idlib, there's this mechanism endorsed by the UN Security Council that delivers aid into northwestern Syria, which is not controlled by the government. Russia always threatens to veto this every 6 months because it wants aid to go what's called cross-line from government-held areas into northwest Syria. It wants more leverage for Damascus. Turkey really wants cross-border aid to continue. And so far, the Russians have played along on the Security Council over the last year, and observers also credit this to Turkish pressure on Moscow. Moscow just cannot afford to antagonize Ankara right now on this issue. Only recently, I think, you see Russia becoming a bit more adventurous in Syria with the airstrikes on Idlib. I haven't mentioned another deconfliction mechanism which exists between Russia and the United States in northeast Syria, and that's increasingly in jeopardy now because Russia has engaged in unsafe intercepts with coalition aircraft over the last few months. I mean, basically the US Air Force at this point is saying the deconfliction mechanism for all intents and purposes is dead. Of course, both sides accuse each other of violating it. But you see this greater Russian emboldenedness at the moment in Syria, and I don't have an answer right now what Russia's endgame is here or where it wants this to go. But there's been a bit more kind of not wanting to step on Turkey's toes is the bottom line. In Libya, there haven't been so many changes to Russia's or Turkish position, but there has been a certain, speaking to Russian analysts, there's a certain sense that were major fighting to break out in Libya again, Russia wouldn't necessarily have the bandwidth really to deal with it. So some Wagner fighters were redeployed from Libya to Ukraine, but not significantly. I mean, those who were on the ground basically said that Wagner's presence remained solid over the last year. Russia is also trying to stay politically relevant. So they just reopened their embassy in Tripoli a few months ago. They're opening a consulate in Benghazi, so they clearly don't want to cede this space to Turkey. And the big question going forward is what's going to happen with Wagner's presence in Libya. I don't have a full answer to that question. I just know that there haven't been major movements reported since the Wagner mutiny. There is apparently some concern among the LNA, with whom Wagner works there, of an unwieldiness of Wagner. And, if they can do this in Moscow, then gosh, what could they do here in Libya, according to some local sources? But I think we have to sort of see how this plays out. However, last Friday, there was an alleged drone attack from Western Libya onto an airbase that is controlled by Wagner. And some sources attributed that, said this was a Turkish drone launched by forces of the Western government. So there the question mark in the air is, what does that mean? Does maybe Turkey or those that Turkey work with see some room here now to press Wagner in Libya? I think in the South Caucasus, there's a perception here of reduced Russian clout, Russia not successfully dealing with conflict in this region. When fighting broke out last September, Russia did very little, and I think Armenia was very disappointed and made that known at the CSTO summit last fall. And I think some say that Azerbaijan might even, push the Russian peacekeepers out, whether that's before November 2025, which I think is when the mandate expires, or in November 2025. And Armenia is engaging in some sort of diversification of its ties to hedge against, this perception. I think stepping up defense partnership with India, for example. Also with Iran, though the West is, I think, warning Armenia not to take that relationship too far. Very quickly, I'll note that, and we can talk about this more, but I think in the Russia-Turkey relationship, economic leverage has also shifted more in favor of Turkey, which is a big shift since before the war. And the final thing I wanted to say is that there's now a new kind of nexus being created between the Middle East region and South Caucasus. It's not an entirely new nexus, but you see it more relevant now, which is Iran's and Israel's role and them taking their conflict increasingly into the South Caucasus region, which is also, I think, happening partially against the backdrop of the Ukraine war. So already after the Second Karabakh War, the Iranians became quite nervous about gains by Azerbaijan and Turkey in the region. So according, part of the territories that Azerbaijan reclaimed or took, occupied during the Second Karabakh War, border with Iran. And then there's also this, for Iran, very vexing issue of the Zangezur corridor that's meant to be created as an outcome of the ceasefire terms of the Second Karabakh War. So Article 9 of that ceasefire agreement calls for, quote unquote, unblocking of all economic and transport connections, most notably between Azerbaijan and the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic. So you see it down there, I think, in the orange. If the Zangezur corridor were to be created, it would basically cut off Iran's land route to Armenia. And so Iran is vehemently against the Zangezur corridor. Worried about losing sort of direct transportation links with Armenia, worried about sort of losing out influence more broadly vis-a-vis Azerbaijan and Turkey in the region. What you've seen basically against the backdrop of this is a flare-up between Iran and Israel that is manifesting in the region. Azerbaijan is increasing its defense ties with Israel. It's gotten quite a lot of weapons from Israel in the past years. I think Azerbaijan a few months ago opened an embassy in Israel, and they're continuously talking about expanding their defense relationship. And the Iranians are trying to push back. They think that Israel is now also gaining a foothold in the South Caucasus to harm basically Iranian interests. So they're trying to push back. There was an incident in January, I think, when there was a shooting at the Azeri embassy in Iran and someone was killed, and then Azerbaijan evacuated its embassy in Iran. Azerbaijan has expelled Iranian diplomats. It's called on its citizens not to go to Iran, and meanwhile, there's an attempt to enhance ties with Armenia. So you see this kind of, the conflict between Israel and Iran, which is already complex as it is in the Middle East because it plays out with different Iranian proxies from Syria and Lebanon and takes all these different forms. It's now leaving a bit more of an imprint even on this region. I think I'll end here and we can discuss.
Thank you so much.